Ever wondered about drunkenness in the Bible? Well, it exists, it's there, and it happens multiple times. And that's something we're going to explore on this 162nd episode of The Jewish Drinking Show, bringing L'chaim to life.
Welcome everybody to another episode of The Jewish Drinking Show. I'm very excited to welcome back, second time guest to the show, Dr. Rebekah Welton. Dr. Welton, welcome back.
Thank you so much for re-inviting me and having me back again. It's wonderful. Thank you.
Absolutely. All right. So for those less familiar with Dr. Welton, she is a lecturer in Hebrew Bible at the University of Exeter in the UK. Her monograph, He is a Glutton and a Drunkard, Deviant Consumption in the Hebrew Bible, published in 2020, focuses on the use of food and drink in ancient Israelite religion and is a revision of her doctoral thesis. She is also published on the winemaking metaphor in Isaiah 49:26 and 63:6 in the Journal for Interdisciplinary Biblical Studies. She teaches a class on God, food, and alcohol in Israelite cultures for undergraduate students and continues to enjoy teaching and researching on food and, more importantly, alcohol in the Hebrew Bible and ancient Israel. So obviously very relevant. And I will also point out for listeners that in this book has not only sort of the broader piece about the son, this drunkard, and so forth. But she also has, more significantly, especially in chapter 5 in that book, very pertinent to our conversation today, a chapter on excessive alcohol consumption in the Hebrew Bible, which I have reread for our conversation today about drunkenness in the Bible because, and correct me if I'm wrong, I have not done the research. You have. How much out there was there previous to your book really about drunkenness, or as you title this chapter, excessive alcohol consumption in the Bible?
Not very much. I remember when I was doing the research and I looked up, stuff about drinking wine or getting drunk in the Bible. There was a preponderance of publications that were very confessional in nature and were very much about why, as a religious person, mainly this is Christian, you shouldn't be drinking alcohol. And then all of these arguments about how when Jesus turns the water into wine, it's not really wine, and all this kind of explication, trying to justify why it isn't really alcoholic wine and it's just grape juice or something. Because,
out of a curiosity, when were those written? Yeah. Were they happen to be in America in the 1920s or 30s by any chance?
There was some a bit later. This was a long time ago, but okay. I'm sure there definitely was, absolutely. Yeah. But then also I think with kind of the Southern Baptist movement, there has also been stuff coming out of there that's trying to use the biblical text as defense for abstaining from alcohol, which I think is taking quite large liberties with what the text actually says in order to try and fit that anti-alcohol agenda. So I came across a lot of that when I was originally doing this research. There was some bits on wine and there was some bits on, kind of Michael Homan's early stuff about trying to make this justification for including beer, and that was really helpful. But texts that were about actually the phenomenon of drunkenness. What did it mean to be drunk? What cultural attitudes were there towards drunkenness and intoxication in the biblical world? Nobody had really focused on that. And I think that probably goes to show that there is a lot of sensitivity, a little bit of kind of cringiness, I think, for a lot of different groups to think about their ancestors, the ancient Israelites, being people that would get inebriated. There's something a little bit disconcerting for certain people of certain attitudes and opinions to think that would be something that these people engaged in, which of course inebriation has been part of the way we've evolved. We've been drinking since we became since the arrival of grapes and grain. That's one of the reasons grain was domesticated. So to try to see this as some kind of behavior which we should be ashamed about is quite antithetical, but due to the course of Western history has become something that's become a kind of touchy subject. I think that other disciplines, other scholarly areas have been able to, study the phenomenon of drinking and the social roles that it has as for human beings, and take it as what it is, which is a human behavior, and treat it without a kind of bias about whether there's like immorality attached to it, or whether it's a debauched behavior, or whether it's, But once you get into the realm of religion, and particularly Christianity, it suddenly becomes this very different kind of topic, because there's all this anxiety about, whether it's respectable, and whether there's actually some sort of overlap between drinking and having religious experiences. And I think that we want to really take seriously the world and culture of the people that lived around the time of the Bible. We have to take seriously the fact that they were cultures that were drinking and were producing wine. That whole region of the earth was a massive wine producing culture, and to ignore that is to ignore kind of a fundamental part of their daily life. So I'm hoping that the tides are turning anyway on that front.
Sounds great. Sounds like a great opportunity for us to transition into the text. So we're going to kick off with a few different texts from the book of Genesis. We have chapter 9 in the book of Genesis. It's Noah. Now, this is not an obscure text by any stretch of the imagination. I think even for casual biblical readers, or probably even for people who really haven't read much of the Bible, this is a pretty well-known story, not in any way obscure. And it's not only the first appearance of wine, specifically mentioned, but and then also drunkenness. And then while there is an ambiguity as to what exactly happened, there something sexual, perhaps transgressive, occurs. Focusing just on the wine and the drunkenness part, it's not terribly transgressive or bad, right?
No, I mean, the text itself doesn't say, and the fact that Noah got drunk is terribly immoral or sinful or anything like that. It's actually just very matter of fact about the fact that who was the first person to be a vintner, who was the first winemaker, and given the trajectory of events that happens in Genesis, we've got the flood. Noah, sets upon dry land, and so he must be the first one to have planted a vineyard. He is the tiller of the soil. So I think that it's kind of one of these etymological stories about how did we discover winemaking? How did we first make wine? And it makes sense then in a post-flood time period to give that accolade to Noah. But I think that it also relates to his name. What does Noah mean in Hebrew?
It's related to resting.
Yeah, like rest and relaxation. And I think that we can think about enjoying wine as an aspect of resting and relaxation. He's named that because he's seen as somebody who will bring rest and relaxation. And he does that through his gift of giving the knowledge of winemaking to Israel. I think initially, I think it's kind of intended to be quite a positive attribute of Noah. He wine drinking was central to the culture of ancient Israel. Somebody has to be the originator of that. It's Noah. This is a good thing. This is a prestigious thing. Then the story takes a turn.
Right. So it's interesting because he's described as an Ish Hadamah, a man of the earth, which sounds to me like he's talented. Maybe he's talented and skilled, and he knows what he's doing. And then because of the ambiguity exactly of the translation of this, but maybe he was the first to plant, maybe through his ingenuity, maybe his skills, he was the first to plant a vineyard. And then I think also in your book, I never thought about it this way, but this is the first time we've read of planting, the first crop or product, which I never perceived it that way. It's not only that he was the first to plant a vineyard, but this is the first plant that we see planted.
Yeah, I guess there is an implication in the Cain and Abel story that Cain must have
harvested,
planted, I suppose. But it doesn't explicitly talk about him planting. Right.
Interesting. Yeah. He gathered, but we don't read of him planting. Okay.
Yeah. I mean, I'd have to go back and look at actually what word is used to describe Cain. But it says he brings produce of the field. Whether that's a field he plowed and planted and harvested, or if he just gathered it from somewhere, perhaps.
Yeah.
But
So, but one thing one thing I'm always amused by is one thing I think about is if he's the first to plant a vineyard, we definitely see that he's the first to drink, at least in writing. But I imagine the way that I think about it is if he was maybe these vines grew, but he was the first to organize them, maybe in a vineyard per se. And then no one necessarily had the volume before. And I'm just reading between the lines. Maybe no one had the volume before, and maybe people had a glass or two, but he had the volume to continue drinking. And he, at the end of the harvest, at the end of letting it ferment, he was very excited, and he just enjoyed himself and fell asleep. And that's wonderful, right? It's just happiness. And then he wakes up and something else happens, which I did explore in a separate episode with Dr. Bergsma so we definitely explored sort of the consequences of this piece. Yeah. But in and of itself, it's not necessarily or inherently bad what he did. It seems almost more that something got done to him.
Absolutely. I absolutely agree with you there. Yeah. There's no sense in which Noah here is being blamed for these subsequent events.
Right.
He's just survived. He built an ark. He survived a flood. He deserves a bit of R&R. He deserves to have a glass of wine at the end of that apocalyptic strife, I think that the text isn't condemning him drinking or condemning him getting drunk. However, what it does imply is that being drunk can lead you to be vulnerable. It can lead you to being in a circumstance where you don't have your full wits about you, and somebody might take advantage of that. And I think, therefore, in this narrative, the fact that he's drunk works as a helpful narrative device for the next bit of the story. But I think that you could equally have had two separate stories where there's just this idea of the positivity of the origin story of wine after the flood, and then also a story could have had a separate story where Noah's asleep in his tent and this horrible thing happens to him. But I think it creates a narrative bridge to have one lead on from the other, because the text in no sense condemns the drunkenness itself. It doesn't say it's a sin. It doesn't say you shouldn't have done it. There's no negative language used in relation to the drunkenness.
Right. I would almost say it's almost like a bit of a surprise to him.
Oh, yeah.
And not just what happens, but even just the falling asleep, getting drunk.
Yeah.
It was really just really tasty grape juice. And so I think this is a very stark contrast, sort of the surprising aspect to the next time. Now, while there's no specific mention of drunkenness in the next this text in chapter 19, it is more than clear that this is a matter of drunkenness. And I think also that the wine here is, as opposed to Noah sort of seemingly to be surprised by the getting drunk, the daughters of Lot quite clearly and conscientiously and quite plannedly are very much intending to achieve drunkenness for their father.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, again, there's this sense in which the wine itself isn't a bad thing, but it's the way it's used or the context in which it's being used that creates this narrative opening for something negative to happen. But the drinking itself isn't the immoral thing. It's the opening that provides the opportunity for the subsequent action. And I think that what's really interesting about both of these narratives is that in both of them, the person who consumes the alcohol falls asleep, and then there's some kind of sexual interaction afterwards. And I think that that's very telling, because it would seem to me that there are also other texts in the Hebrew Bible in which alcohol is used as a precursor to sexual intercourse or other sexual interaction, not necessarily where they're asleep, but there's this idea that it is a social lubricant, or even a sexual social lubricant. It allows people to become more laid back and might even be seen as a kind of aphrodisiac because of the way it reduces inhibitions. And so, for example, in the story of David and Uriah, David invites Uriah back to feast and drink with him to try to encourage him to go see his wife Bathsheba to cover up the pregnancy that David has caused. He says to Uriah, go and wash your feet. Feet is a euphemism for penis, for the genitals. So he's literally saying, go and have sex with Bathsheba after he's encouraged him to drink wine. I think that also happens in Ruth. Naomi tells Ruth to not approach Boaz until after he's finished eating and drinking. So I think
and he's feeling good.
Yeah, exactly. There's this common understanding that somebody who's a bit more tipsy is probably going to be more likely to have sex with you. And I think that underlying cultural information is creating the context for these two stories where Noah and Lot both get drunk and then something sexual happens to them.
Yeah. And two other things. One is it's the book of Genesis, so there's offspring that come out of these interactions, both of these interactions. But what you mentioned, the sexual aspect, it's hard to ignore that the very first two instances of drunkenness in the entirety of the Bible, sex happens, right? And so it's funny because it's hard now to think about, or drinking, both of them including, there's one other mention of wine between the two, but there's no necessarily drinking, it's wine as a gift. But in both of them, sex happens, although maybe potentially transgressive one way or another, but that's not something that's gone away from humanity. The association of wine or alcohol more broadly, and no one says, well, though these texts are outdated, they have nothing to do with humanity at this point in time. They've remained with humanity for the rest of time. That I'm not saying that every single time that people are drinking, sex is going to happen, but it's not like it can happen.
Absolutely.
And not necessarily of a consensual nature.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
And certainly for anybody who, deals with university students, that can happen.
Yeah, or even just ordinary people who are not university students.
That's also true, but there's a certain, I don't know, at least in America with university students, it seems to be certainly all the more so than necessarily non-university
Right,
students.
I see. Yeah, there's a certain stereotype there, which may be based on some truth.
Indeed.
Yeah, exactly. So this story doesn't come across to us as something that's completely unbelievable or hard for us to understand what's going on, because we see it in our cultures as well.
Hey there, I hope you're enjoying this episode so far. I wanted to break in and actually let you know this is not the only episode on drunkenness to come out this year. In fact, we have a whole handful of episodes coming out in a little mini series on drunkenness. So you can go check out this along with other episodes all at jewishdrinking.com/drunkenness for episodes, clips, and more. And I hope you're enjoying this episode. I hope you go and check out those other episodes on drunkenness. And now back into this episode on drunkenness.
So there's one final verse in Genesis of drunkenness, and this one I point out to people and they're shocked. They've read this before and they're shocked, although I think part of it also goes down to English translations, and definitely English translations that I've read. I'm curious about you. They don't try to translate it by getting drunk. They try to go away from it. Yeah, be merry. All these obscure, they obfuscate it. And it's clearly a choice on the part of the translators. You could have just gone with drunk. Why not just Occam's razor it? But they try to go away from it.
Yeah, well, I think it's this squeamishness about not wanting to think about Joseph and his brothers being drunken disorderly. They don't want to think about that. They don't want to think about Joseph being like that, even though the text isn't saying that, it's being positive. But I think there's a squeamishness about translators.
And I think all the more so because nothing negative happens.
Yeah.
I think, they can't just get away with being drunk and being happy and nothing bad happening. There's got to be a negative consequence. Well, let's just retranslate it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that when with us in the English language, drunkenness implies a bit more negativity than I think it did in the Hebrew. And I think that's why perhaps then there's that sense where if we see the word drunk, or the translators see the word drunk, and there's nothing negative about the context in which it's happening, they think, oh, let's soften it a bit and turn it to merry.
Yeah. And I also think about, yes, I totally agree with you. One thing that I think I shared with you the previous time we spoke, this might be a little cutesy, but in Genesis 9, it seems like the wine is a surprise. The effects of wine seem to have a surprise on Noah, and then he's taken out. Genesis 19 with Lot's daughters, they have no confusion about what they're using it for, and they successfully achieve their aims. they are able to use it to for non-consensual activity with their father. But then finally here, I see it as almost like a synthesis, that there is nobody is having anything bad done upon them, that there is harmony here. There's not only a harmony of amongst brothers, but a harmony with the drinking, and nothing bad happens to anybody, consensually or otherwise.
Absolutely. It's a lovely evolutionary arc from surprise and negativity, control and negativity, and then control and positivity.
Yeah, that's how I see these 3 drunken stories in the book of Genesis, which really, I think, sets the stage really for the remainder of the Bible as to the relationship with drunkenness.
Yeah, absolutely.
One final drunkenness mention in the Torah is this poetic mentioning in Deuteronomy 32:42. I will make my arrows drunk with blood. This is a poetic usage that they're just as a person, when they are drunk with something that could be reddish, they consume a lot of and get really drunk. Here, it's just simply of one's enemies being killed with a lot of arrows.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I've thought about this a bit, and it's not in the Torah, but in Ezekiel, where you've got that kind of text where the birds and the animals come and feast on Gog's army. It talks about them drinking blood to drunkenness as well, but that obviously is about consumption of blood, whereas here this is about an arrow kind of absorbing blood, I suppose, and then it being described as drunk. It is quite peculiar because I think that it's about the kind of excess of death that's being caused using these 2. Obviously, it's paralleled by my swords devour flesh. So this idea of consuming as killing and destruction and so I think that it is clearly related to the idea of excess, like vast quantities, but also drunkenness gets used as a metaphor to talk about kind of the intoxicating experience of being in love in Song of Songs. So drunkenness, I think, or shakar, I think, does get used in other ways than just to refer to the experience of being inebriated by an alcoholic substance, but can also refer to other types of like embodied overwhelming feeling or overwhelm of death. In this way, I think there is like a sense in which it kind of indexes a heightened kind of experience, such as in this case, a military context.
This seems to be the next mention, which is this Hannah instance with Eli said to her, "How long will you make a drunken spectacle?" And this is also a mention of beer. There's a beer reference in the story. He says, "Have you been drinking?" And she says, "Well, ultimately not. There's something about her emotional state that comes off as if she is drunk, and he thinks she's had beer or wine, and yet she's consumed nothing." But do you have anything on this?
Yeah, well, but for me, this one is really about the English translation again, and kind of the kind of gendered implication that's being made here. Nowhere else in any other translations that I've found does the word drunken spectacle or the phrase drunken spectacle get used. And even in texts where men get drunk, they're never called a spectacle. The Hebrew doesn't say drunken spectacle in this text in 1 Samuel 1:14. And I think that there's something here about the fact that it's a woman that's drinking. That is, I don't know why, but again, it's this squeamishness about consuming alcohol and being inebriated, and the connotations that has in a modern context, not in an ancient context, but in a modern context. And they add in this word spectacle into what Eli is saying in a way that makes it sound like she's just absolutely going wild. It conjures up the image of somebody who's in complete disarray, makeup down their face, vomit on themselves, acting, excessively in their expression, in their language, and their tone. It even makes you think of maybe like violence or other kind of impolite behavior. And it's just not there. All she's doing is praying.
Yeah, I should have changed this translation. It's just literally until when will you be drunk? Okay. But you're right. It does. It's not a great portrayal, but it's just simply in the Hebrew. It's just how long will you be drunk?
Yes, exactly. Why
Yeah.
couldn't they have kept it like that?
I guess she's a mess. She's a mess.
Well, but the text doesn't say she's a mess. That's the imagination of the translator.
Well, I mean, she doesn't come off great. I mean, in Ailey's eyes, she's drunk.
Yeah, but a drunken spectacle?
Fair.
That's different. And I think that's the issue I have with the translation. I think that it's making more of the Hebrew than the Hebrew elsewhere in other texts.
This is something you mentioned earlier of
Yes,
David.
here we go, the Uriah text. Yeah.
Yes, it was a nice foreshadowing. David summoned Uriah. He ate and drank with him until he got him drunk, and then he went out to sleep. So this is
Yeah. Well,
so you mentioned there was a sexual congress piece to this.
Yeah, because Bathsheba's pregnant, David's got her pregnant, and David needs to cover this up somehow. So he invites Uriah back to his palace, and the first thing he says is, "Go down and wash your feet. Go down to your house and wash your feet." And Uriah says, "No, I don't want to. I need to stay with my soldiers." He wants to be loyal to his military men.
Mm-hmm.
So then when he hears this, that he hasn't gone down and had sex with Bathsheba, this is then David summons him and eats and drinks with him until he gets drunk. And then but in the evening, Uriah went out to sleep in the same place with his lord's officers, and he did not go down to his home. So this is why it's a but. It didn't do what David wanted it to achieve. It didn't lead to Uriah having sex with Bathsheba. This is kind of it's kind of in between the lines. It doesn't spell out, the whole reason David got him drunk was so that he would go and have sex with Bathsheba, but you can see that there's no other real way you can interpret this. And it clearly is part of the cultural understanding of one of the properties of alcohol being something that may lead to or more easily lead to somebody having sex.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
It's there.
It's there, yeah.
Hey there, I hope you're enjoying this episode so far. I want to break in and give you a sneak peek into next week's episode, because after all, if you are interested in drunkenness in the Bible, you might be interested in drunkenness in early rabbinic texts. We now have a story in the Mishnah of a woman. This was now a woman. She's offered a glass of wine, but she's already drunk. She's at this party. She says, you know what? I'm a Nazareth from this. Which is kind of strange because she clearly has been drinking. She is already drunk. She is gone. She's like, no, I can't. I'm now Nazareth, right? I'm Nazira. So what do they do with this? I hope you enjoyed that sneak peek into next week's episode on drunkenness in early rabbinic texts. Now back into this episode with Dr. Welton.
And then we get into some really colorful stuff in the later prophets. So we have these Jeremiah texts. I'll just, if that's an okay bunching or categorization, Jeremiah texts or Jeremiah texts, if you will. So we have Jeremiah 25, drink and get drunk and vomit, fall and never rise again. We have Jeremiah 48, Hashki Ruhu, get him drunk for he vaunted himself against God. Jeremiah 51:7, Babylon was a golden cup in God's hands. Mishakeret, Kol haaretz miyena, it made the whole earth drunk. Jeremiah 51:39, Vihish Kartim, get them drunk. Jeremiah 51:57, Vihish Karti Sarehev Chachmecha, I will make her officials and her sages drunk. So we have this handful of Jeremiah texts, but this is not a drunkenness of enjoyment.
No,
this is
absolutely not.
Of sort of almost like a forced upon punishment, maybe.
Yeah, I would say absolutely is a forced upon punishment. This is a set of texts that often get referred to as belonging to or exhibiting the motif of the cup of wrath. So the idea that Yahweh creates, the idea that Adonai creates a cup of alcohol, usually wine, and offers it usually to foreign nations. It leads to them to become excessively drunk, falling asleep, vomiting, stripping themselves naked, basically leaving themselves in a really vulnerable situation so that they can be punished through their defeat by Israel. So basically, this idea of drunkenness is used metaphorically in a subverted way. So not going with the expectation of offering wine to a guest, an act of hospitality that's going to aid as a social lubricant and create positive social bonds and kinship, and lead to something that is, joyful and full of merriment. It flips that on its head. So here, Adonai is not the benevolent host, but actually offers the cup as a punishment, something they can't refuse. They have to drink it down, and it leads to the most chaotic drunken consequences that provides the perfect opportunity for them to be killed by the sword in a military conquest. Mm-hmm. So it's really, really interesting how it uses the understanding of what alcohol could mean in social occasions, but then flips it on its head and turns it into this shocking image of punishment and defeat.
Absolutely. So I'm going to quote your book. So on page 211, you wrote about this motif as a motif functioning as an effective metaphor on the basis that drunkenness was known to cause extreme helplessness in the face of utter destruction. And then you continue on, and this is really great writing. The cup of wrath motif employs images associated with drunkenness to convey to God's punishment and destruction of both Israel, Judah, and other nations, and particularly appears in prophetic books in the Hebrew Bible, such as Jeremiah, and we'll soon see Isaiah. The motif offers some of the most colorful and detailed depictions of drunkenness, which, because of their striking nature and common usage, could not be missed from this discussion. The motif of being offered a cup functions as a vehicle for the inescapable fate of punishment, likely because of the social custom of receiving a drink from a host, which could not be refused. So that's certainly, well, it's obviously a great description, but it really, I like your language of inverting expectations. That is something that we should be, usually the drunkenness is something that's enjoyed, but here's it's something being forced upon people to, from which to suffer.
Absolutely. And what's really interesting is it works as a metaphor because when you look at all the other texts in the Hebrew Bible, which we've discussed, the idea that it can be used to make you vulnerable, the idea that it can be used to prelude sexual activity. There are texts where military leaders get drunk and they lose the battle in certain texts. It doesn't use the word shakar, but it says that they drinking in their tent, then they lose a battle. All of those texts kind of create this perfect foundation to then have this fantastic metaphorical idea of Adonai feeding Israel's opponents alcohol in such amazing poetic language, which is terrifying and shows the kind of ultimate power and control that Adonai has. In the same way that Lot's daughters completely control the situation to get Lot drunk, Adonai is totally in control to get the opponents drunk so that Israel can come out victorious. And it's just, the metaphor works so perfectly in harmony with all the other aspects of alcohol consumption and drunkenness that we see in other biblical texts.
We got Isaiah. So not just Jeremiah, but we have Isaiah 29. This one, well, actually, maybe this is a separate thing. They are drunk, but not from wine, which is an amusing thing. But the idea is, and then of course it says liquor. They didn't have liquor back then. But this idea of being drunk, and it's not from alcohol, but it's an image maybe of this helplessness. They're not in total control of their motor functions. Right. We have Isaiah 49. They shall be drunk with their own blood as with wine. But that's not.
This is what I disagree with in terms of the translation. But this is my own very unique out on a limb kind of idea. So I think here that the Hebrew, I think to get to this English translation, you've got to do a few somersaults with the Hebrew. So I think a different translation is better and is in more accord with what the Hebrew actually says. So in every other biblical text, apart from 2 in Isaiah, when you're saying that somebody is drunk from a substance, like from wine or from a cup or from a drinking feast, the preposition that's always used is min, from. In this text, you can see where it says the asis, that is, the preposition there is ka, which means as or like. It doesn't mean from.
Mm-hmm.
Therefore, I think that a better translation of this is not to understand shekar as referring to drunkenness, but about the process by which something becomes a substance that can make you drunk. So in other words, fermentation. So, and like grape juice, because
you're saying it ferments or it goes on its own journey of being made an intoxicant.
Yes.
Okay.
Because asis, I argue, and many other biblical scholars and commentators have also said, asis more likely refers to grape juice. You know, the juice you've got before you've treaded it and it's frothed and foamed and turned into wine. Yayin is wine, tirosh is wine, asis earlier in the process, grape juice. So the asis, and like grape juice, damam, their blood, and then yishkarun.
So they will be interesting. Okay.
Because the thing is that if you want to keep it as the English that you've got there's two prepositions there which are not in the Hebrew, with their own blood as with wine. So there's two withs there which are not in the Hebrew. So it kind of doesn't really make sense as a word for word translation. So that's what I've argued. There's another in Isaiah where I think something similar is happening. So I think because there's two examples of this, it seems more. If there was just one, I'd be like, whatever. But because I've done two, I was
going to say a counter argument could be if it's like the verse in Deuteronomy where you have the consumption in the first piece, and then now you have the drunkenness as a parallel. But
yeah, and that's why I considered that Deuteronomy verse a lot, to try and figure out if I felt like that was really affecting this translation idea. I still think that because asis is not alcoholic, it can't cause drunkenness, and the preposition isn't min. I think those 2 points still, I think, support what I want how I want to translate this.
Okay. All right, cool. All right. So
I think that would you not agree that it's nice to think that they did have a word to talk about fermentation? Because otherwise, we'd have no way of getting a sense of them understanding the winemaking process and what that transformation from a non-alcoholic substance to an alcoholic substance is. So I think that fills that gap. You know, what word did they use to describe that process? They needed something. And why not have it be a word that uses the same root letters as used to describe something that is somebody who has consumed that alcoholic beverage?
Yeah, it's neat. I have not spent a lot of time on Isaiah, so I appreciate your insights. And then we have here Isaiah 51 and 63. And again, these are both drunkenness, but they're not like literally. They're not actually from drinking. And it really is all of Isaiah. It's not actually, none of them. He's not actually talking about actual drunk people.
No.
Just acting drunk.
Yeah. The one in 63 is the context of a wine vat. There's nobody's drinking anything. There's no feasting. There's no cup of wrath. There's no cup being offered there. Earlier in this chapter, it's talking about seeing Adonai approach, and his robes are all stained red, like somebody who has been treading in a wine press. And I think that what we've got here again is a context where it's a metaphor that's imagining Adonai punishing people using the context of a wine vat to explain that, because obviously trampling grapes would have looked very, if you imagine that that's people, then that is a very violent physical act, being trampled. But then being trampled doesn't lead you to being drunk. And again, in the Hebrew, the preposition is not min, the preposition is ka. Sorry, it's not, it's birth in this one, in my rage. So he's trampling in his rage because he's punishing them. This wouldn't make them drunk. This would make them ferment. So again, I would translate this as I fermented them in my rage.
Very neat. Cool.
So that's just my little opinion. That isn't a widespread. That is my own weird idea. So
3 more in the prophets. We have Habakkuk says, "Oh, you make you who make others drink to hoi mashke re'ehu, one who gets others drunk. We have Haggai, that you drink without getting drunk, another sort of reflecting the Isaiah pieces. And then Nahum, who says, you too shall be drunk. So, thoughts on these?
Yeah, so in this Habakkuk text, as you pour out your wrath to gaze upon their nakedness, again, this is part of the cup of wrath motif. So forcing somebody to consume something which contains the wrath of Adonai as a punishment, and it leading to these sexual connotation kind of events, such as stripping naked in a kind of sexually shaming kind of event. I mean, like that Isaiah 51:21 passage, just after that verse, which you haven't got there, it talks about the cup of trembling. So it's saying you're drunk, but not from wine. You're drunk from God's punishment, the cup of trembling. It's so that's again another part of that cup of wrath motif. In this Haggai text, though, this is kind of like one of those texts that's about your harvests kind of failing. So like you've sowed much, but you brought in little. And even though you eat, you're not going to feel full. And even though you drink, you're not going to get the effects, the benefits of drinking. So again, this text is more about kind of how no matter how much you try, you won't get the desired outcome. So it's not that drunkenness is bad, or in this text, if anything, in this text, drunkenness is a desired outcome, but God is holding it back in the same way that he's holding back the harvest and the feeling of satisfaction after eating, etc.
Cool.
Nahum, again, this is part of the cup of wrath motif. Getting drunk allows you to be vulnerable, and you're overcome by your opponents. The prophets use alcohol and food imagery a lot to talk about divine blessing and divine punishment, because of course food was so precarious. Drought, famine, disease were all so prevalent in these times that it could be rationalized by saying, oh, well, this harvest has been good because God has blessed me. Oh, this harvest has been bad because God is punishing me for something. It was kind of a way of explaining the unexplainable. I don't know why this has happened to me, so maybe I did something wrong. The cup of wrath and this idea of other nations becoming drunk and being attacked could also be used. And of course, eventually when Judah is attacked by the Babylonians, that also gets justified as, well, I did something wrong, so God must have been the one in control of it. And there are texts, which I think we're about to see in Lamentations, where it talks about God having Judah drink the cup so that they become vulnerable to the Babylonians.
So now we're on our final two here, at least of the root of shikur, of drunk, and these are in the writings. So now we've passed the prophetic text, and now we're into the writing. So we have Eicha, Lamentations, and this is not like you mentioned. This is not a literal cup. This is more of that cup of wrath motif.
Yeah, absolutely. So in this text, we've got, again, so rejoice and exult for Edom, who dwell in the land of Uz. To you too the cup shall pass. You shall get drunk and expose your nakedness. So obviously in the book of Lamentations, this is written in a context where the Judahites and the Israelites are in exile in Babylon. And this is kind of that kind of sense in which eventually everything will set its, like, stuff is rubbish right now, but eventually the cup will go off to the cup will eventually be given to the Babylonians, and they will be the ones that have to take the punishment. So the cup is continually passed around. Whoever is suffering defeat, they are the ones that get the cup. And expose your nakedness. This again is about that sexual element to drunkenness that we see in other biblical texts.
Finishing off with a Song of Songs. This is at least more pleasant than a cup of wrath motif.
Yes.
This is, as opposed to all the prophetic works, which I don't have a lot of familiarity with, but Song of Songs says wine is pretty treasured. It's, I think the first verse or two, it really is the best thing in the world until love comes along and sort of displaces it as the best thing in the world. So wine is treasured beverage here, and even including here in this verse, Shasisi Yeni, I've drunk my wine. But here it says, eat, lovers, and drink, get drunk of love. Drunkenness is not a bad thing. It's encouraged here.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, Song of Songs is obviously a love song or even an erotic song. It's full of euphemisms and metaphors for lovemaking. There's lots of parallels with other texts from neighboring cultures that relate drunkenness to sex and lovemaking in that erotic kind of genre of poetry. And Song of Songs is absolutely in that same genre with those. All the way through the song, it's talking about vines and bunches of grapes and fruits, and it's all about fertility and juicy fruit and wetness and sweetness and all these senses. It's very, very sensual. I think there's a real overlap here between the experience of drunkenness and the experience of love and the experience of sex, and how it's all about these liquids. Your body consumes alcohol, but there's also an exchange of liquids in sexual intercourse. And I think that this is all at play in a very euphemistic, highly poeticized, metaphorical way in the song. They can see and they are celebrating the way in which alcohol and fruits and honey and milk, all these liquids, are all evocative of the embodied experience of love and lovemaking. In addition to that feeling of being drunk on love, like being intoxicated by somebody and somebody else's body, it provides so much language. Intoxication provides so much language for talking about the feeling of love and being in love. It's so overlapping and so interconnected because, again, it's part of the human experience. And I think it's an amazing part of the Bible, and the way that the two lovers in the story, their bodies are described in terms of being like fruits and honey and flowers and apricots, and it's really, really fascinating, but absolutely not negative at all. It's a celebration of this very embodied physical sensual experience.
Hey there, I want to break in yet again. Although I asked for support in financial ways because it does cost some money to make the hosting happen and other aspects of Jewish drinking happen. So your financial support is definitely appreciated. And don't forget, you can go to jewishdrinking.com/donate. But also, another way of supporting the show and everything that Jewish Drinking does is also to tell your friends, tell your neighbors. If you like this content, if you like this show, maybe people also like it. So feel free to let them know, hey, I have this interesting episode I heard, or a few episodes, or whatever it is, or even a few clips. Feel free to share with your friends. All right, thank you so much. Now back into the show.
Drunkenness in itself, and we saw in Genesis, there seems to be a thesis, or a synthesis rather, of these drunkenness stories, which serve foundationally as the way we perceive drunkenness, and then it happens throughout. I mean, David, you mentioned with Bathsheba, and there's not a lot of other drunkenness stories per se.
Not stories, like narratives where somebody becomes drunk. Like in Samuel, Absalom gets Amnon to drink at the feast so that he can be attacked. That again, it says when his heart is merry. It doesn't say drunk. So that occurs in a narrative. So I think there are other cases of people clearly drinking to a point where they're vulnerable, but it might not use shachar as in the Hebrew. But they still all add to this kind of general kind of picture that we've created about how, yes, it can make you vulnerable, it can lead to these things, but it's not that it's nobody's stoned to death for getting drunk.
Before we go, Dr. Welton, is there anything you would like to promote?
Just remembered that I have got a chapter coming out in an edited volume about alcohol and religion. So it's coming out shortly, I think in 1 or 2 months. It was meant to be an interdisciplinary volume about religion and alcohol, and they asked me to contribute a chapter, so I obviously did stuff on wine and beer in the Bible, and also some stuff about kind of this squeamishness we're talking about translations and biblical scholarship, and why there hasn't been very much attention on drunkenness in the recent past. And I'm chapter 1 because I kind of did it chronologically. So it begins at the Bible, there's 2 chapters on Jewish stuff. So actually, I think you'd be interested in talking to those 2 people as well, potentially. And then goes through into other religious contexts and the use of alcohol in those. The volume is called Holy Waters, Interdisciplinary Studies on Religion and Alcohol. So that should be coming out relatively soon.
Very neat. Very neat. All right. Well, Dr. Welton, thank you so much. And l'chaim.
L'chaim. Thank you so much, Drew. Thank you.
Absolutely.